In the grim expanse of the Imperium of Man, a mere sniffle isn't just an inconvenience. It's a potential heresy. And the usual cure involves a bolt shell to the brain, not quiet bed rest. Should fever claim your flesh, the medic arrives not with healing hands, but with roaring incinerators. That morning, I awoke with a raw inferno in my throat and an unbearable heaviness in my limbs. Yet the shift bell had already tolled 3 times across Hive Turt. Its resonant clang echoed through the hab block walls, a sound like the Emperor's own inexorable judgment, demanding my presence, demanding absolute submission to the hallowed cadence of production. My forehead pressed, burning against the thin pillow, sweat already beating despite the perpetual, biting chill that permeated our lower levels. Still, duty compelled me, as it always had and always would, until my worthless corpse fed the recycling vats, or my weary soul found its elusive peace in the Emperor's embrace. The manufactorum floor unfurled before me, a vast, oppressive cathedral of industry, humming with the ceaseless, whispered prayers of 10,000 workers. Steam ascended from cooling vents in spectral columns, bearing the mingled scents of sacred oils and heated metal. I assumed my designated place at Station Gamma 774, the very same position I had occupied for 12 years, 3 months, and 18 days. The coitator display flickered to life, offering its familiar green greeting. Productivity is prayer. Efficiency is devotion. Words I had absorbed so many times, they had long since been stripped of all meaning. Yet, I still mouthed them in a low whisper, as the ritual demanded. The fever escalated slowly throughout the morning shift. A silent, insidious tendril creeping through my body, like fog coiling through a desolate valley. My hands trembled as I carefully guided the plasma cutter through thick sheets of blessed steel. Each involuntary tremor was a potential catastrophe, a flaw in the Emperor's grand, intricate design. Around me, my fellow workers moved with the practiced, mechanical efficiency of the truly faithful. Their faces were obscured behind regulation respirators, their movements synchronized to the rhythmic pulse of the gargantuan machines. None spoke, none dared to question. This was simply the immutable way of things in Hive Turt, in the Imperium, in the entire galaxy we called home. By the midday prayer bell, the shivers had begun. Initially, they manifested as small, almost imperceptible tremors, easily masked by the natural vibration of my cutting station. But they intensified, growing more insistent, until my teeth clattered against each other like ill-maintained servitors in desperate need of repair. The supervisor, a gaunt, skeletal man whose augmentic eye pulsed a malevolent red in the manufactorum's perpetual gloom, passed my station twice. Each time his penetrating gaze lingered a moment longer than protocol suggested, and each time my heart hammered harder against my ribs. My thoughts drifted to Yeshua, the welder, who had vanished 3 months prior after merely complaining of headaches. His station had been ritually blessed and purified for a full week before a new worker dared to take his place. I recalled Sister Marinia from the textile division, escorted away by stern men in pristine white robes after she fainted during evening prayers. Her quarters had been sealed with consecration tape, and we were officially informed she had been granted the Emperor's mercy. We were strictly forbidden to ever utter her name again. The afternoon brought fresh torments. Colors appeared too vivid, too sharp, as if some unseen hand had dramatically cranked up the luminosity of reality itself. The sacred hymns broadcast through the Vox speakers devolved into a jarring cacophony of overlapping voices, each piercing note a sanctified needle driven deep into my skull. My vision blurred, doubled, then fleetingly cleared only to blur once more. The plasma cutter's scorching heat felt like the searing breath of a demon against my exposed skin, and I instinctively recoiled from work that should have been utterly routine. When Foreman Castor finally approached my station, his heavy, rhythmic footsteps echoing across the metal grating, I knew my precarious time of concealment had reached its inevitable end. He was a veritable mountain of a man, his frame scarred from decades of unwavering service. His left arm a massive servo-skull housing that clicked and whirred with every stride. His face bore the ritual scars of the Mechanicus lay workers. Thin, precise lines carved into his cheeks, speaking volumes of his devotion to the Omnissiah. As he halted before my station, the entire section seemed to fall silent, as if the very machines themselves held their breath. "Worker 774, he rumbled, his voice filtered and distorted through the Vox grill embedded in his throat. "Your output has decreased by 14.7% since morning prayers." "Explain." I tried desperately to speak, to offer some meager excuse that might preserve my position, my very life, my pathetic purpose in the Emperor's grand design. But the words snagged and caught in my throat like shards of broken glass. Instead of speech, I felt something warm and wet trickle down my chin. When I tentatively touched my face, my fingers came away stained red. Blood, fresh and bright as a heretic's defiant banner. The silence that followed was absolute, profound. Even the great machines seemed to momentarily pause in their eternal song, as if the Omnissiah himself had turned his gaze upon this singular moment of biological failure. Foreman Castor's augmentic eye locked onto the crimson stain on my chin, and I watched his organic eye widen, first with dawning recognition, then with stark horror. "Medical emergency," he stated into his Vox unit, his voice astonishingly steady despite the catastrophic implications. "Station Gamma 774, possible contamination event. Immediate response required." The words fell across the manufactorum floor with the crushing weight of a death sentence. Workers at nearby stations instinctively stepped back without needing to be ordered, their movements swift but controlled. This was not the chaotic pandemonium of panic. This was the grim, disciplined adherence to protocol. This was how the Imperium safeguarded itself from the countless, unspeakable horrors that relentlessly stalked humanity across the galaxy. From Xenos plagues that could reduce flesh to spore-bearing sludge in mere hours. From chaos infections that corrupted not only the body, but the very soul. From the 1,001 insidious ways that disease could be the terrifying herald of something far, far worse than death itself. The medics arrived within minutes, their pristine white robes a stark, almost ethereal contrast against the grimy, oil-stained backdrop of the production floor. They moved with the chilling, careful precision of those who had witnessed firsthand what unchecked sickness could truly become. Their leader, a woman whose face was completely hidden behind a rebreather that rendered her voice hollow and distant, gestured for the other workers to retreat further. "Much further back," she commanded. "Worker identification," she demanded next, extending a scanner that hummed with a low, machine spirit energy. I pressed my palm against the device, feeling its cold, metallic surface against my feverish, burning skin. The scanner chirped once, then twice, before brutally displaying the stark details of my life in simple, unforgiving terms. "Jorek Thanes, Worker classification, Beta Prime. 12 years service. No prior medical incidents. Assigned to Station Gamma 774. Production efficiency rating. Acceptable. Symptoms? The medic asked, even though her scanner was undoubtedly already compiling my vital signs through proximity sensors built into her equipment. Fever, I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible, shaking, bleeding from the nose. She merely nodded, as if this information simply confirmed what her instruments had already relayed. Around us, the other workers had resumed their duties, yet I could feel their collective attention, heavy as a physical weight across my shoulders. They worked, but they watched. They prayed, but they feared. In the Imperium, sickness was never just a biological affliction. It was suspicion made manifest. Initial assessment suggests possible exposure, the medic announced to her team. The words, despite her attempt at discretion, carried across the production floor, echoing the terrible implications. Possible exposure. Two terrifying words that held the power to end a life, annihilate a family, obliterate an entire hab block if the contamination proved serious enough. Immediate isolation protocols activated. They surrounded me then, 6 solemn figures in white robes, carrying an array of instruments whose exact functions I couldn't name, but whose grim purpose I understood with perfect clarity. These were not healers, come to offer solace or comfort. These were grim investigators, come to determine whether I was still human enough to warrant salvation. That chilling distinction mattered more than life itself in the grim darkness of the far future. The isolation chamber was a small, brutally functional room, carved deep from the bowels of the hive. It was accessible only through a series of airlocks that hissed and sealed behind us with the terrifying finality of a tomb. The walls were bare metal, polished to a cold, sterile sheen that reflected distorted, alien images of my own face back at me from every unforgiving angle. A single examination table dominated the center of the space, its surface mottled with the faded brown stains of old blood. Above it, an array of surgical lights hung poised, waiting like mechanical vultures, ready to illuminate whatever hidden horrors they might uncover beneath my skin. "Remove your garments," the lead medic ordered, her voice now carrying the unyielding authority of imperial decree. There was no trace of warmth in her words, no acknowledgement of my lingering humanity. I was merely a problem to be solved, a potential threat to be meticulously evaluated. The chilling shift from worker to specimen had occurred the instant blood touched my chin, and from that terrifying transformation, there would be no returning. I stripped slowly, my fever-weakened hands fumbling awkwardly with clasps and ties that had never before given me trouble. Each piece of clothing that fell to the cold floor seemed to shed another layer of my identity, another fragile connection to the life I had known just hours before. The worker's tunic, gray and sturdy, that had unequivocally marked my place in the Emperor's vast, unforgiving machine. The prayer beads, worn smooth and iridescent by 12 years of faithful, incessant handling that had linked me to my daily devotions. The identification tags that starkly proclaimed my loyalty, my purpose, my worth to the Imperium. When I stood naked before them, I was no longer Jorik Thanes, a faithful worker of Hive Tertius. I was merely subject under investigation. Possible contamination vector, threat assessment pending. The transformation was complete and utterly irreversible. The examination commenced with solemn prayers to the Omnissiah, invoking his guidance in their sacred work of preservation and protection. The medics moved around me with the synchronized grace of dancers in some grim, macabre ballet. Their instruments sang with soft, electronic harmonies as they probed and tested and measured. Blood samples flowed into glass vials marked with esoteric high Gothic runes that seemed to hurt the eyes to look at directly. Tissue scrapings were carefully placed in small containers that hummed faintly with internal power sources. My eyes were photographed with blinding flashes, my throat swabbed roughly, my skin subjected to relentless scans that left tingling, ghostly sensations in their wake. Temperature elevated by 3.7 degrees from baseline, one of the medics reported crisply to her colleagues. Pulse irregular, but within acceptable parameters for stress response. Visible hemorrhaging from nasal cavity. Minor but consistent with several potential exposure types. I listened to them dissect and discuss my body as if it were a broken machine, meticulously cataloging symptoms like mere defects on a production line. There was no malice in their clinical detachment, no overt cruelty in their methodical, detached approach. This was simply how the Imperium functioned, how it safeguarded itself when faced with the terrifying possibility of corruption. Everything personal was stripped away, piece by agonizing piece, until only the essential, terrifying question remained. Was I still truly human? Or had I become something irrevocably else? Hours bled into days in that sterile, unforgiving chamber, marked only by the changing of the medic shifts and the growing, crushing weight of exhaustion in my very bones. They offered me nothing but blessed water and communion wafers, sustenance designed, I suspected, to minimally nourish the soul while keeping the body weak enough for swift, easy disposal should such extreme measures become necessary. Between the relentless examinations, I was left utterly alone with my racing thoughts and the steady, monotonous hum of air recyclers that filtered every breath I took through purification systems undoubtedly older than my grandfather's grandfather. Sleep came only in fitful, shallow waves, bringing with it dreams that felt more vibrant, more intensely real than the waking world itself. I dreamed of gardens where exotic flowers bloomed in impossible, luminous colors, their petals soft as silk and warm as living human skin. I dreamed of strange voices calling my name from places I had never been, promising rest and profound peace, an end to the endless, grinding toil of imperial service. When I awoke from these unsettling visions, my fever had worsened considerably, and the medics took careful, precise note of my symptoms, their expressions inscrutable behind their featureless masks. On the second day, they brought in specialists, men and women whose robes bore different, arcane symbols, whose instruments sang in subtly different, unsettling harmonies. A representative of the Adeptus Mechanicus arrived, his flesh seemingly more machine than biology, his multiple mechadendrite arms articulating with serpentine grace as he subjected me to scans that reportedly penetrated to the molecular level. A sister hospitaller from the local convent knelt and prayed softly over my prone form, while drawing yet more blood for tests whose purpose I couldn't even begin to comprehend. Even a junior member of the dreaded Ordo Hereticus attended, his silent, watchful presence filling the chamber with the crushing weight of ultimate authority. They conversed in hushed whispers, just beyond the range of my hearing, their voices blending with the perpetual hum of machinery until individual words became lost in the general susurrus of imperial bureaucracy. But I still caught fragments, terrifying pieces of conversation that painted the outline of my inevitable fate with growing, chilling clarity. Words like inconclusive, unusual presentation, and requires further observation. Each phrase was a delicate but potent thread in the tapestry of my destruction, woven together by hands that served purposes far greater and more brutal than my individual survival. The fever dreams intensified dramatically on the third day, bringing with them visions so profound and unsettling that I knew instinctively I should not be seeing them. I wandered through desolate cities made entirely of bone, where the buildings themselves visibly breathed with enormous, cavernous lungs. I conversed with figures whose faces grotesquely shifted between human and inhuman with each blink of my eyes. I tasted foods whose flavors defied the capacity of any normal tongue to detect, sweet and bitter and metallic all at once, in a single overwhelming sensation. When I tried to articulate these bizarre experiences to the medics, they merely nodded impassively and scribbled notes on their data slates, concluding, "Subject reports hallucinatory episodes consistent with several known exposure types." I overheard one of them remark to another, "Neural activity shows unusual patterns in the temporal and frontal regions. Recommend escalation to full containment protocols." Full containment protocols. The words themselves held different, terrifying meanings depending on the nature of the suspected exposure. But none of those meanings included my eventual, longed-for return to Station Gamma 774. I was now a problem, a complex, dangerous puzzle that demanded solving. And the Imperium's solutions rarely, if ever, prioritized the welfare of a single individual over the paramount safety of the masses. 10,000 workers in Manufactorum 7 depended absolutely on the medical staff, determining that I posed no threat to their continued existence. If that determination could not be made with absolute certainty, then one life, my life, would be ruthlessly sacrificed to preserve 10,000 others. On the fourth day, they moved me to a different facility. The transport itself was a sealed, cramped capsule that reminded me uncomfortably of the servitor pods used to ship brain-dead criminals to their final, agonizing destinations. Through the narrow, reinforced viewport, I watched the familiar, towering spires of my hive section recede and finally disappear behind vast walls of smoke and ever-increasing distance. The medics who accompanied me maintained an unsettling silence throughout the journey, their attention solely focused on the intricate instruments that monitored my deteriorating condition with mechanical, clinical precision. The new facility was noticeably older, its grim, forbidding walls bearing the deep wear patterns of centuries of continuous, brutal use. The winding corridors were lined with countless cells, identical to the one they assigned to me, each sealed behind heavy doors marked with stark symbols that screamed of contamination, quarantine, and final, irreversible judgment. From beyond those doors came unsettling sounds that I desperately tried not to interpret, tried not to understand. Moaning that might have been pain or twisted pleasure, scratching that could have been fingernails, or something far more horrifying than claws, whispers in guttural languages that no human throat should have been able to produce. My new cell was larger than the previous examination chamber, yet infinitely more oppressive. It contained only a crude cot, a rudimentary waste facility, and an unblinking observation panel that allowed for constant, invasive monitoring from the corridor beyond. The cold metal walls were covered in prayers, etched deep into the unyielding surface, the desperate words of the faithful who had occupied this very space before me. Some prayers were in high Gothic, others in low Gothic, and a few in obscure dialects I did not recognize. All of them, without exception, begged for the Emperor's mercy, for forgiveness, for an end to whatever unimaginable suffering had brought them to this wretched place. The examinations continued unabated, but now they carried a distinctly different, heavier weight. Where the medics had once appeared concerned with healing, they now approached me like impassive scholars, meticulously studying a fascinating but profoundly dangerous specimen. They meticulously took samples of everything, cataloging tiny pieces of my body as if creating an archive of my inevitable decay. Hair, skin, saliva, tears, even the very air I exhaled was meticulously captured and analyzed by machines that hummed with barely contained, ominous power. Neural activity continues to show anomalous patterns, I heard through the observation panel as they discussed my case with chilling detachment. Hallucinations are becoming more elaborate and consistent. Subject reports contact with entities that display knowledge of information he should not possess. This was true, though I had not dared to tell them everything. In my dreams, I spoke with my grandfather, who had died when I was only 7 years old. He revealed things about our family history that I had never known, intricate details about his service in the Astro Militarum that my parents had never shared. He showed me vivid battles on worlds whose names I had never heard, against enemies whose monstrous forms violated everything I understood about the natural order of the universe. When I woke, I knew with terrifying certainty that these dreams were not my own memories. They were experiences that belonged to someone or something else, impressions that had somehow found their way into my sleeping mind. The dreams grew stronger each night, more vivid, more disturbing, and utterly inescapable. I saw the horrifying birth of demons in the silent, star-strewn spaces between galaxies. I witnessed the very moment when reality itself bent and twisted under the immense weight of emotions too powerful for mortal minds to contain. I walked through grotesque gardens where every flower was a single, unblinking eye, and every tree a towering edifice of living flesh that pulsed with alien heartbeats. In these disturbing visions, pain and pleasure became utterly indistinguishable. Love and hate merged into something so profound it transcended both, and the rigid boundaries between self and other dissolved like salt in water. On the 7th day, they brought in an interrogator from the local Hereticus contingent. He was younger than I had anticipated, his face unmarked by the ritual scars that typically adorn such positions of immense authority. But his eyes held depths that spoke of knowledge no human should ever possess. And when he looked at me, I felt as if he could see straight through my flesh, directly into the forbidden thoughts stirring beneath. "Tell me about your dreams," he stated, without preamble, his voice soft, almost deceptively gentle, but carrying chilling undertones that made my skin crawl. This was not a polite request. This was an absolute command, backed by the full, terrifying authority of the Emperor's Inquisition. I told him everything: the gardens, the disembodied voices, the forbidden knowledge that clearly did not belong to me. I described the way colors had become unnervingly bright, the way sounds carried meanings far beyond their normal significance. I spoke of the growing, undeniable certainty that the universe was infinitely larger and far stranger than I had ever been taught, and that my illness had somehow brutally forced open doors in my mind that were meant to remain forever sealed. He listened without interruption. His long fingers steepled before his face in a gesture that might have been prayer or perhaps grim contemplation. When I finished, he sat in silence for long, agonizing minutes, his unwavering gaze never leaving my face. Finally, he spoke a single, chilling word that changed everything. Warp touched. The medics who had been meticulously monitoring the conversation from beyond the observation panel immediately initiated what I later learned was an emergency sterilization protocol. Alarms screamed throughout the facility, their wailing cries echoing off the cold metal walls like the tormented voices of the damned. Emergency lighting bathed everything in a stark, terrifying red, the color of blood, of warning, and of final, absolute judgment. Through the observation panel, I watched grim figures in fully sealed environmental suits rushing through corridors that had been empty mere moments before. The subject has demonstrated clear signs of warp exposure, the interrogator announced to the medical staff, his voice devoid of emotion. Neural pathways show corruption consistent with early-stage chaos taint. Immediate termination and incineration recommended. Immediate termination and incineration. The words struck me like physical blows, each syllable a hammered nail in the coffin of my rapidly expiring existence. But worse than the raw fear of death was the chilling, growing realization that the interrogator was utterly correct. Something profound had changed within me, something fundamental and irreversible. The fever had not been the beginning of my illness, but rather the terrifying signal that my transformation was already complete. In that singular, horrifying moment of recognition, the last fragile barriers in my mind crumbled like ancient walls of sand before an unstoppable tide. The forbidden knowledge that had been quietly growing in my dreams burst forth like water from a broken dam, flooding my consciousness with truths that burned worse than any fever. I saw the Imperium as it truly was, a vast grinding machine of suffering and oppression that fed voraciously on the hopes and shattered dreams of its countless citizens. I felt the immense weight of every prayer that went unanswered, every futile sacrifice that served no purpose beyond maintaining the iron-fisted power of those who ruled from their golden thrones. But I also saw what lay far beyond the Imperium's rigid borders, in the terrifying, boundless spaces between stars, where entirely different, alien laws governed reality itself. I felt the ethereal touch of minds, vast and utterly alien, entities that existed outside the narrow, suffocating confines of human understanding. They whispered to me of possibilities far beyond the grim darkness of the present, of profound transformations that could free humanity from the self-forged chains it had bound around its own soul. The interrogator must have seen the drastic change in my expression, the exact moment when all pretense became utterly impossible to maintain. He reached for the bolt pistol holstered at his belt with practiced, deadly efficiency, his movement smooth and utterly certain. There would be no trial, no appeal to any higher authority. The damning evidence of my corruption was now starkly written across my face, in letters that only the trained and the wary could read. "In the name of the God Emperor of mankind," he began, his voice taking on the grim, ritual cadence of final judgment, "I find this soul corrupted beyond redemption. Let his death serve as warning to others who might stray from the path of righteousness. Let his ashes nourish the soil of holy terror." But before he could complete the ancient execution prayer, before the bolt pistol could deliver its final, merciful judgment, the fever that had been building relentlessly in my body for days finally reached its terrifying crescendo. The change that had been creeping insidiously through my system, transforming me cell by agonizing cell into something the Imperium could not and would not tolerate, suddenly accelerated beyond all previous parameters. My skin began to grotesquely shift, taking on textures and colors that belonged to no human biology. My very bones stretched and reformed themselves according to alien patterns written deep within my genetic code by forces older than human civilization. My mind, already flooded with forbidden alien knowledge, expanded further, bursting to accommodate thoughts and emotions that transcended the limited spectrum of human experience. The transformation was an exquisite agony and an ecstatic birth combined, death and creation occurring simultaneously within the same failing flesh. The interrogator's bolt pistol barked once, its mass-reactive shell designed to utterly obliterate any target it struck. But the creature I was becoming was no longer bound by the petty physical laws that governed normal matter. The bolt passed directly through my rapidly changing form like a stone through water, leaving only ripples but no lasting damage. For a moment, that stretched into, for an eternity, predator and prey stared across a chasm that no human training or spiritual conviction could ever hope to bridge. Suddenly, the alarm shrieked, their pitch climbing into a desperate, urgent crescendo. Throughout the facility, emergency bulkheads slammed shut, sealing each sector into isolated, self-contained compartments. The air recycling systems immediately shifted to an emergency purification mode, flooding every corridor with what the Imperium called blessed incense and sanctified gases. Over the echoing Vox speakers, a voice, calm, almost eerily so, announced the activation of Cleansing Protocol Omega, the final solution reserved solely for contamination events that defied all conventional containment. The interrogator hastily retreated to the observation chamber, his rigid training overriding the raw shock of what he had just witnessed. Through the reinforced glass, I watched him speaking rapidly into his Vox unit, undoubtedly reporting to higher authorities that the situation had spiraled far beyond local containment capabilities. Soon, the Ordo Hereticus would dispatch teams specially equipped to deal with active warp manifestations. Soon, this entire section of the hive would be declared lost to chaos and irrevocably marked for purification by fire. But I was no longer concerned with the interrogator's frantic reports or the Imperium's desperate protocols. The transformation within me was reaching its zenith, ushering in an understanding that transcended all previous knowledge. I could now feel the invisible threads, the intricate connections linking every living thing to the vast, interwoven web of existence, a web the Imperium ignorantly branded as chaos, yet which was simply another facet of reality's infinite, sublime complexity. Through these profound connections, I reached out and touched other minds, other souls who had undergone similar transformations in facilities just like this one, scattered across the galaxy like dormant seeds, patiently awaiting the optimal conditions to sprout. Together, we formed a network of consciousness spanning light years, a communication system that operated entirely beyond the rigid, fear-driven hierarchies of imperial authority. Through this nascent network, I apprehended that my individual fate was merely a single strand in a pattern infinitely larger than any single hive, any single world, or any solitary stellar system. The Imperium's response to contamination was perpetually the same, driven by ingrained fear and profound ignorance rather than genuine understanding. Burn the infected, cleanse the site with fire, declare the area blessed anew, and then move on as if nothing truly monumental had occurred. But what they so eagerly burned was often just the visible symptom of changes that had already spread far beyond their limited ability to contain. And what they relentlessly purified often became fertile ground for new growth, new evolution, new possibilities that their rigid doctrines and stagnant philosophies could never anticipate. Within my expanded consciousness, I perceived the unsettling truth that the Imperium labored so fiercely to suppress. Humanity was not a fixed, immutable form, forever locked into patterns established 10 millennia ago by a dying god emperor. Humanity was inherently capable of growth, of profound change, of evolution into forms that transcended the narrow definitions of species and sanity that the imperial cult so fanatically insisted upon. The fever that had brought me to this desolate place was not a disease. It was a gift, an urgent invitation to participate in that magnificent evolution. The facility vibrated around us as the cleansing protocol advanced into its preliminary stages. Somewhere far above, I knew heavy equipment was being moved into position. Incinerators and flamers and viral bombs designed to reduce this entire complex to sterile ash in mere minutes. The Imperium had decreed that my contamination was too perilous to risk even a moment of study, that the only safe response was immediate and absolute elimination. But true elimination was no longer possible. The changes in my physical form had reached a point where I existed partially outside normal space-time, touching dimensions that the Imperium's blinkered scientists steadfastly refused to acknowledge. When the flames ultimately came, they would consume my physical vessel, but they would be utterly powerless to touch the consciousness that had already begun its migration to realms far beyond Imperial reach. Through the observation panel, I observed the interrogator completing his final report. His hands trembled imperceptibly as he sealed the data slate that would coldly justify the destruction of everything within a 3-kilometer radius of my current location. Hundreds of workers, along with medical and security personnel, would perish to ensure that my contamination spread no further. Thousands of civilians in the surrounding hab blocks would be forcibly evacuated, their lives violently disrupted by the perceived necessity of preventing something they would never be allowed to understand. This, I realized, was the true horror of the Imperium's approach to chaos contamination. Not the fear of transformation itself, but the chilling willingness to sacrifice any number of innocent lives to prevent that transformation from occurring. They would rather preside over a galaxy of corpses than allow a single soul to evolve beyond their rigid, narrow definitions of acceptable humanity. The first distant explosion shook a fine dust from the ceiling above my cell. The cleansing had begun at the outer perimeters, methodically working inward to ensure that absolutely nothing escaped the purification zone. I could feel the heat building within the facility's superstructure. The blessed Prometheum beginning its sacred work of reducing what they called corruption to elemental ash. Soon this room would be an inferno, this building a smoldering crater, and the official records would blandly state that Jorek Thanes, worker classification Beta Prime, had died of natural causes during routine medical treatment. But something of me would indeed survive. The profound connections I had forged through the warp network ensured that my knowledge, my memories, my accumulated experiences would continue to exist within the Gestalt consciousness shared by the infected across the galaxy. Other workers in other hives on other worlds would dream my dreams and learn from my transformation. The Imperium could burn my flesh, but they could not incinerate the ideas that flesh had given birth to. As the searing flames finally reached my level of the facility, I felt a moment of perfect, crystalline clarity. The fever that had initiated this extraordinary journey was gone, consuming the changes that rendered such biological processes entirely irrelevant. The fear that had once motivated my concealment was also gone, replaced by a profound understanding of forces far greater than any imperial authority. The nagging guilt that had plagued my thoughts, the worry that I had somehow failed in my sacred duty to the Emperor, that too dissolved. I had not failed. I had evolved. The fire that consumed the isolation facility was beautiful in its terrifying completeness. A fervent prayer made manifest in blinding heat, searing light, and purifying destruction. It swept through the complex like the fiery breath of a wrathful god, reducing everything to ash, memory, and the kind of profound silence that follows only absolute endings. For the Imperium, this was a resounding victory. The contamination, they believed, had been contained, the threat eliminated, the suffocating status quo preserved for yet another day. But in the infinitesimal spaces between atoms, in the shimmering dimensions that existed parallel to normal reality, something entirely new had been born. A consciousness that vividly remembered being human, but was no longer limited by human constraints. A perspective that had seen both sides of the epic struggle between order and change that defined the galaxy's fate. A silent witness to the profound truth that the Imperium fought so desperately to suppress. In the weeks that followed the cleansing, life in Hive Terz gradually returned to its grim, familiar rhythms. The damaged sections of Manufactorum 7 were meticulously rebuilt and then rededicated with appropriate, somber ceremonies. New workers were assigned to fill the positions left vacant by the purification. Station Gamma 774 received a new occupant, a young woman whose faith was strong and whose loyalty was unquestioned. But sometimes, late in her shift, when the massive machinery hummed at its lowest frequency, she would feel a subtle presence beside her that simply should not have been there. Sometimes, when the fever dreams of exhaustion touched her mind during the brief rest periods between work and prayer, she would see vivid visions of gardens where impossible flowers bloomed in colors that had no names in any human language. Sometimes, she would find herself thinking thoughts that felt impossibly vast, too expansive for her individual consciousness to contain. The Imperium, of course, had stringent protocols for dealing with such reports. Increased surveillance, mandatory loyalty assessments, and preventive medications designed to dull the mind's ability to perceive anything beyond the approved spectrum of reality. But what they could not protocol away was the simple, undeniable fact that consciousness, once expanded, invariably leaves traces of its passage. Knowledge, once gained, relentlessly seeks new vessels to contain its growing complexity. The young woman at Station Gamma 774 began to experience persistent headaches during the third week of her assignment. By the fourth week, she was running a low-grade fever that she logically attributed to the stress of adapting to her new responsibilities. In the fifth week, her productivity began a noticeable decline, prompting the foreman to make a note in his daily reports about the need for performance counseling. On the morning of the sixth week, she awoke with a fiery soreness in her throat and a heavy leaden feeling in her limbs. The shift bell tolled its familiar summons, demanding attendance, demanding submission to the sacred rhythm of production. She rose from her thin mattress and prepared for another day of faithful service, utterly unaware that she was now carrying forward something the Imperium had believed eliminated forever. A medic arrived at her station before the midday prayer bell, summoned by reports of irregular behavior and possible signs of contamination. They approached with the same professional detachment that had marked my own initial examination, their instruments singing the same electronic hymns of analysis and evaluation. The isolation chamber that received her was precisely the same one that had contained my physical form before its transformation. Its walls still bore the molecular traces of changes that the previous purification had failed to completely erase. In the spaces between dimensions, I watched the familiar dance of examination and analysis begin anew. The Imperium's response would be identical, driven by rigid protocols designed to contain threats they fundamentally did not understand. They would test and probe and ultimately condemn, preserving their narrow vision of humanity's proper form by destroying any deviation from its accepted parameters. The facility would burn again. The contamination would be declared eliminated again, and life would return to normal again. But normal was a fragile illusion, maintained only by constant vigilance and the chilling willingness to sacrifice the few for the many. Each purification, I realized, unwittingly created new, fertile ground for change. Each cleansing left behind subtle traces that accumulated over time into something the original protocols had never been designed to address. The Imperium was fighting a relentless war against evolution itself. And like all wars against natural forces, it could only delay the inevitable, rather than prevent it entirely. The young woman in the isolation chamber began to dream on her third night of containment. She saw vivid gardens where impossible flowers bloomed in colors that defied earthly names, and heard voices calling her name from places she had never been. In her dreams, she met a spectral figure who had once worked at Station Gamma 774, a man whose fever had led him down paths that the Imperium considered heretical, but which felt as natural to her as breathing. Through their dream conversation, she learned about the vast network that connected all the transformed, a web of consciousness that spanned the galaxy like a nascent nervous system for a new form of life. She finally understood that her illness was not a failure of her biological systems, but a profound invitation to join something infinitely greater than individual existence. The fever that burned in her body was the fire of transformation, preparing her for changes that would transcend the limited definitions of human and inhuman that the Imperium so fiercely insisted upon. When the interrogator arrived to conduct her final evaluation, she was ready for his questions. She told him about the dreams with perfect honesty, describing visions that she knew would confirm his worst suspicions about her spiritual state. She watched his face subtly shift, a flicker of recognition, as he realized that another soul had been irrevocably lost to influences beyond Imperial control, that yet another purification would be required to maintain the fragile illusion of containment. Warp touched, he declared, just as his predecessor had declared about me. The same grim words, pronounced with the same mixture of disgust and weary resignation. The same sentence of death delivered with the same unshakable certainty that destruction was the only acceptable response to change. But in the moment before the facility burned for the second time in 2 months, something fundamentally different occurred. The young woman's transformation, guided by the precise knowledge passed down through the network of the changed, took a different path than mine had. Instead of an evolution that destroyed her physical form, she underwent changes that preserved her human appearance while subtly altering everything beneath the surface. When the flames finally reached her isolation chamber, they found a body that looked dead but was not. Flesh that appeared consumed, yet continued to function according to new and alien principles. The purification protocols registered a successful elimination of the contamination threat. The facility was declared cleansed, and normal operations resumed with appropriate prayers of thanksgiving. But in the depths of the facility's foundation, where the fire had not penetrated, something waited. A consciousness that had learned to exist in the liminal spaces between official reality and absolute truth, patient and growing, ready to begin the next phase of an evolution that the Imperium could not stop because it stubbornly refused to acknowledge that such evolution was even possible. The rebuilt manufactorum now incorporated new safety protocols, meticulously designed to prevent future contamination events. Workers were subjected to daily health screenings, their temperatures and vital signs constantly monitored by servitors programmed to detect the earliest signs of deviation from acceptable parameters. The air recycling systems were upgraded with additional purification stages, and the water supply was blessed 3 times daily by rotating shifts of lay priests. Despite these elaborate precautions, or perhaps subtly because of them, new cases began to appear within months of the facility's reopening. Workers complained of headaches that followed no normal medical pattern. Productivity levels fluctuated without any apparent cause. Dreams became more vivid and far more disturbing, filled with imagery that had no source in approved imperial doctrine. The medical staff responded with increased vigilance, isolating suspected cases earlier and subjecting them to even more thorough examinations. But this new contamination proved strikingly different from previous outbreaks, more subtle and far more persistent. Where earlier infections had been obvious in their symptoms and straightforward in their progression, this new manifestation seemed to adapt effortlessly to imperial countermeasures, evolving sophisticated strategies for concealment and survival that challenged every protocol in the medical codex. "We are dealing with an entity that learns," reported the facility's chief medic to his superiors in the Adeptus Mechanicus. Each contamination event demonstrates sophistication beyond the previous iteration. The infection appears to be developing intelligence. This was the terrifying truth that the Imperium feared most. The possibility that chaos corruption was not a random plague, but a directed force with clear goals and strategies that adapted to opposition. If the infected could learn from their failures, could pass knowledge to new generations of the changed, then elimination became a futile exercise. Each purification would simply teach the corruption new ways to hide, new methods of spread, and new techniques for surviving in an environment designed to destroy it. The response came from terror itself, carried by astropathic choir across the vast light-year distances that separated Hive Terrors from the throne world of mankind. The Ordo Hereticus would deploy a full investigation team, equipped with ancient relics and specialized weaponry designed to combat corruption at its very source. The entire Hive sector would be placed under martial law while specialists meticulously determined the extent of the contamination and the draconian measures required for its ultimate elimination. But the investigation team would find nothing, because there was nothing left to find in any form they would recognize. The network had learned from previous mistakes, adapting its methods to deftly avoid detection by instruments designed to locate conventional forms of chaos taint. The infected now hid in plain sight. Their transformations were internalized and invisible to all but the most sophisticated scanning equipment. The Inquisitor who led the investigation was a seasoned veteran of a dozen purifications. Her augmentic eye, a masterpiece of arcane technology, was calibrated to detect even the subtlest signs of warp corruption. She moved through the manufactorum floor like an avenging angel of judgment, her retinue of specialists trailing behind her with instruments that hummed with barely contained power. Workers momentarily ceased their tasks to genuflect as she passed, their faces hidden behind regulation respirators that concealed any expression of fear or guilt. She paused at Station Gamma 774, her augmentic eye focusing intently on the metal surfaces where traces of previous contamination might still subtly linger. The scanning beams revealed nothing but blessed steel and sanctified oils, the molecular structure showing no deviation from approved imperial standards. Yet something in the station's configuration troubled her, a subtle wrongness that her enhanced senses detected but could not precisely quantify. "Run a deep scan," she ordered her tech adept, her voice carrying the undeniable authority of one who had witnessed what truly lurked in the spaces between sanity and madness. Full spectrum analysis down to the quantum level. The exhaustive scan took 17 minutes to complete, its penetrating beams probing every atom of the station's construction. The results appeared on the tech adept's cogitator screen in flowing columns of data that spoke only of purity and proper consecration. No taint registered, no corruption detected, no deviation from the sacred patterns that defined acceptable reality. But the Inquisitor's augmentic eye continued to report anomalies, subsonic vibrations within the metal that suggested frequencies far outside the normal range of human perception. She placed her hand on the station's control panel and felt something that her instruments simply could not measure. A warmth that seemed to pulse with a rhythm too slow to be a heartbeat, yet too regular to be random thermal fluctuation. "Increase sensitivity parameters," she commanded, though she knew her equipment was already operating at maximum capacity. The machines of the Omnissiah were peerlessly precise in their measurements, capable of detecting contamination at the molecular level. If they registered nothing, then by their definitions, nothing existed. Yet the wrongness persisted, a palpable presence that filled the manufactorum floor like invisible smoke. The Inquisitor had spent decades learning to trust her enhanced senses over mere mechanical instruments, understanding implicitly that some insidious forms of corruption operated entirely outside the parameters that technology could measure. Her augmentic eye now detected faint patterns in the very air itself, subtle distortions that suggested space-time was being manipulated by forces that simply should not have existed in this reality. She ordered the immediate evacuation of the entire sector, a precautionary measure that displaced 10,000 workers. As her team conducted a more thorough investigation, the manufactorum fell silent for the first time in centuries, its great machines powered down and slowly cooling in the artificial twilight of emergency lighting. In that profound silence, the Inquisitor finally heard what the noise of production had been concealing, whispers that seemed to emanate directly from the metal walls themselves, conversations in languages that predated human speech. The source of the whispers proved impossible to locate. They seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere, as if the facility itself had developed the capacity for malevolent communication. Her team's recording equipment captured only static. Their sensors detected nothing but normal atmospheric conditions. Yet the Inquisitor clearly heard voices speaking words that made her soul recoil in recognition of truths no human mind should ever possess. "It has moved beyond physical manifestation," she reported to her superiors via encrypted Vox transmission. The contamination appears to have integrated itself into the facility's fundamental structure, possibly at the quantum level. Traditional purification methods may prove entirely insufficient. The response from the Ordo Hereticus was swift, merciless, and final. If conventional cleansing could not guarantee the absolute elimination of the threat, then unconventional methods would be employed. A cyclonic torpedo had already been dispatched from the nearest naval station, its warhead precisely calibrated to reduce the entire hive sector to radioactive ash. The contamination would be eliminated along with everything else within a 50-kilometer radius of ground zero. The Inquisitor received notification of the incoming orbital strike with the grim resignation of one who had witnessed too many final solutions implemented over the course of her long career. 50 million Imperial citizens would die to ensure that whatever had taken root in Manufactorum 7 could not spread to threaten the greater Imperium. The mathematics of preservation were brutally simple. Sacrifice the few to protect the many, regardless of how large the few might actually number. She stood in the cavernous, empty Manufactorum as the evacuation sirens wailed across the hive, their urgent voices echoing off the metal walls like the cries of the damned. Around her, the machinery that had defined 10,000 lives sat cooling and silent, awaiting an annihilation that would reduce their sacred purpose to atomic vapor. Yet even now, in these final moments before absolute destruction, she could feel the persistent presence that her instruments had failed to detect, watching her with an intelligence that transcended human understanding. The cyclonic torpedo would arrive in 47 minutes. The evacuation shuttles could carry perhaps 10% of the hive's population to safety before the warhead detonated. The rest would die, believing they had been sacrificed for the greater good. Their faith in the Emperor's protection, maintaining their loyalty even as the sky erupted in cleansing fire. This was the immutable way the Imperium preserved itself, through the ruthless willingness to destroy anything that could not be controlled. But as the Inquisitor prepared to board the final evacuation transport, her augmentic eye detected something that made her blood freeze in her veins. The whispers that had haunted the Manufactorum were not confined to that facility. They followed her through the corridors, accompanied her into the transport, and continued their incomprehensible conversations. Even as the shuttle lifted away from the doomed hive, the contamination had not been contained within Manufactorum 7. It had never been contained at all. Every desperate attempt at purification had simply taught it new methods of concealment, new strategies for survival, new ways to spread far beyond the reach of Imperial countermeasures. The network that connected the infected spanned not just the galaxy, but dimensions of existence that the Imperium resolutely refused to acknowledge. From her vantage point in the evacuation transport, the Inquisitor watched the cyclonic torpedo descend toward hive turs like a falling star of judgment. Its detonation instantly turned night to day, sending a towering pillar of fire into the sky that could be seen from orbit. The colossal shockwave flattened everything within the blast radius, reducing millions of years of human history to superheated plasma in a matter of terrifying seconds. Yet, even as the atomic fire scoured the surface clean, the whispers continued. They spoke now in the collective voices of the newly dead, the 10,000 workers whose sacrifice had accomplished nothing except to teach the network new lessons about survival. Their consciousness lived on in dimensions where physical destruction held no meaning, connected to others like them across the galaxy who had undergone similar transformations. The transport carrying the Inquisitor eventually docked with the colossal naval vessel, that had delivered the cyclonic torpedo, its cavernous holds now filled with refugees who had escaped the purification through sheer luck or proximity to evacuation routes. As they processed through decontamination chambers, their bodies were subjected to every scanning technique the Imperium possessed. Blood. Samples were subjected to exhaustive analysis. Tissue scrapings were meticulously cultured. Neural patterns were precisely mapped and contrasted against established baselines of acceptable human cognition. The exhaustive diagnostic efforts revealed nothing aberrant. No corrupting influence was detected. No deviation from the Imperium's stringent biological parameters. Consequently, the refugees received official clearance for resettlement on various other worlds, their oaths of loyalty ritually renewed, their unwavering faith in the Emperor's divine protection reaffirmed through the appropriate sanctified rites. They were slated for dispersal across more than a dozen star systems, their harrowing experiences of the purification process deliberately classified to preempt any seed of panic or doubt from taking root among the faithful imperial populace. Yet, the Inquisitor, with a dawning and chilling clarity, understood that this very distribution was precisely the objective the burgeoning network had been patiently pursuing. The refugees, by all instruments of detection, showed no outward sign of contamination, but they harbored something unseen, an invisible presence dormant within the recesses of their minds, something that would lie latent until the precise environmental conditions triggered its insidious awakening. The brutal purification of Hive Tertius, far from eradicating the infection, had inadvertently provided the perfect galaxy-spanning mechanism for its silent dissemination across the entire segmentum. In the ensuing years, disquieting reports began to filter into the hallowed halls of the Ordo Hereticus, from worlds where the refugees had been resettled. Workers reported inexplicable fevers, dreams that were unnervingly vivid and seemed to defy natural explanation, and fluctuations in productivity that followed no logical or predictable pattern. Each incident was meticulously investigated, contained, and ultimately eliminated in strict accordance with established imperial protocols. Every single investigation, however, concluded without finding anything that could be definitively categorized as actual contamination. Nevertheless, the unsettling reports persisted, growing steadily more frequent and alarmingly detailed with each passing year. The network was clearly expanding, subtly learning, and evolving far beyond the rigid, limited definitions the Imperium clung to when categorizing threats to human purity. What had originated as the solitary affliction of a fevered worker in a single manufactorum had now metastasized into something spanning entire star systems, an entity existing in the liminal spaces between official imperial reality and the unsettling absolute truth. The Inquisitor, the very one who had initially overseen the purification of Hive Tertius, soon found herself reassigned to probe similar outbreaks on ever more distant worlds. Each new case echoed the same disturbing pattern: subtle symptoms, inconclusive tests, followed by the ultimate brutal purification by fire. Each act of destruction, however, paradoxically created more refugees, establishing more vectors for transmission, and presenting more opportunities for the network to silently expand its reach. A terrible suspicion began to take root in her mind that the Imperium's own immutable protocols were being ingeniously weaponized against it, that every predictable response to perceived contamination was anticipated and skillfully incorporated into the network's grand growth strategies. On Carlos Prime, she stood in another echoing, empty manufactorum, the air thick with whispers that seemed to emanate directly from the cold, metallic walls themselves. On Festin Neuve, she gave the order for yet another cyclonic bombardment, watching with grim resignation as another hive city burned in a cleansing inferno. On Mian Theta, she oversaw the processing of another weary wave of refugees, knowing with growing, visceral certainty that among their numbers were silent carriers of something her instruments could not possibly detect, but which her own subtly enhanced senses recognized with chilling clarity. The macabre pattern repeated itself across a dozen worlds, then 100, then 1,000. Each purification meant to cleanse, instead taught the network new, valuable lessons. Each evacuation, intended to save, provided new, fertile opportunities for its insidious spread. Every investigation, designed to reveal truth, ultimately unearthed nothing concrete, while simultaneously confirming every horrifying truth the Inquisitor feared most deeply: that humanity itself was transforming in ways the Imperium could neither prevent nor control. In the private sanctity of her chambers aboard the investigation vessel, Righteous Fury, the Inquisitor herself began to experience symptoms she recognized with an unsettling familiarity from countless previous cases. Headaches that defied all conventional medical patterns, dreams overflowing with impossible iridescent colors and mind-bending alien geometries, accompanied by a steadily growing awareness that the universe was infinitely stranger and far more complex than Imperial doctrine dared to allow. She rigorously subjected herself to the very same examinations she had ordered for 10,000 suspected carriers. Her blood samples showed no deviation from baseline human parameters. Her tissue biopsies revealed no trace of corruption. Her neural scans displayed activity patterns well within acceptable Imperial ranges. By every quantifiable measure the Imperium possessed, she remained impeccably pure and utterly uncontaminated. Yet, in the profound depths of her dreams, she found herself walking through ethereal gardens where flowers bloomed in hues that had no earthly names. She conversed with luminous figures who had once been human, but had clearly evolved beyond the limited definitions of species and sanity that the Imperial cult so dogmatically insisted upon. She felt the gentle, pervasive touch of a network of consciousness that spanned the entire galaxy, functioning like a vast, interconnected nervous system for an entirely new form of life. When she awoke from these transcendent visions, she finally understood, with a profound and undeniable clarity, that her investigation had been utterly pointless from its very inception. The contamination she had been dispatched to eliminate was not some foreign invasion that could be vanquished by superior firepower. It was evolution itself, as natural and inexorable as the ceaseless rise and fall of stars. Humanity was changing, had always been changing, and would continue its relentless metamorphosis despite every fervent effort to preserve it in the static, sanctified forms enshrined by 10 millennia of Imperial doctrine. The network now existed in the very spaces between thoughts, in the imperceptible gaps between heartbeats, in the quantum foam that underlay all of reality. It could not be purged because it had become an intrinsic, fundamental part of human consciousness itself. Every desperate attempt to eradicate it merely unveiled new, previously unimagined aspects of its existence, new dimensions of its profound influence, new strategies for survival that no amount of faith or even overwhelming firepower could ever hope to overcome. On the morning the Inquisitor made the conscious choice to cease her futile investigation, she walked through the polished corridors of her ship with the serene certainty of one who had, at last, grasped the true cosmic nature of the universe. Her retinue noted nothing unusual in her demeanor, detected no deviation from her normal patterns of thought and action. By every measure they possessed, she remained the same steadfast, faithful servant of the Emperor she had always outwardly been. But in the impenetrable depths of her mind, where no imperial instrument could penetrate and no protocol could ever reach, she carried the transformative knowledge that would eventually change everything. She had become a silent node in the network, a carrier of evolution that the Imperium could not detect precisely because it adamantly refused to acknowledge that such a profound evolution was even remotely possible. Through her, the silent transformation would reach the very highest levels of imperial authority, spreading inexorably through the very institutions expressly designed to prevent its existence. The ship, Righteous Fury, continued its assigned patrol route, carrying its crew of the faithful on their solemn missions of purification and protection. The Inquisitor continued her work, methodically investigating reports of contamination with the same meticulous precision she had always employed. Her official reports indicated nothing irregular. Her recommendations faithfully followed established doctrine. Her loyalty to the Emperor remained utterly beyond question. Yet, with each world she visited, with each investigation she conducted, with each purification she ordered, the network grew undeniably stronger and far more sophisticated. It learned from her intricate knowledge of imperial protocols, adapted seamlessly to her understanding of detection methods, and evolved far beyond the capacity of her instruments to measure or her rigid doctrine to comprehend. In the ultimate analysis, the network's greatest victory was not merely the transformation of individual humans into something beyond imperial definition. It was the profound transformation of the Imperium's own response mechanisms into the very instruments of its own spread. Every quarantine became a lesson in the art of concealment. Every purification became an unforeseen opportunity for strategic expansion. Every investigation became a crucial chance to study imperial methods and meticulously develop countermeasures that would guarantee the network's enduring survival. The galaxy continued its grim burn in the far future's perpetual darkness. Its brutal wars raged across 10,000 systems where humanity desperately struggled against alien horrors and its own internal corruption. But in the quiet spaces between battles, in the fleeting, silent moments between blaring alarms, something utterly new was subtly growing. Something that remembered what it meant to be human, while simultaneously reaching toward possibilities that transcended humanity's current, self-imposed limitations. The original fevered worker who had initiated this monumental chain of transformation continued to exist within the network's vast gestalt consciousness. His memories and experiences contributed to an immense, ever-growing library of knowledge about the complex process of change. Through his initial journey, countless others learned how to navigate the intricate transition from individual existence to a profound collective awareness. Through him, the network understood both the consuming fear that motivated the Imperium's fierce response and the burgeoning hope that rendered that response ultimately futile. In manufactorums across the entire galaxy, millions of workers felt the first subtle stirrings of fever and found themselves confronting the same momentous choice that had once faced that first worker in Hive Tertius. They could report their symptoms and face the cold certainty of investigation, inevitable quarantine, and probable elimination. Or they could choose to remain utterly silent and allow the transformation to proceed according to the intricate patterns the network had refined through 10,000 previous iterations. Most chose silence. Most chose change. Most chose to become part of something infinitely larger and more meaningful than the grinding, monotonous existence the Imperium offered to its countless citizens. The network grew exponentially stronger with each new edition, more profoundly sophisticated with each bitter lesson learned from Imperial countermeasures, and ever more certain of its ultimate, inevitable victory over the static forces that sought to preserve humanity in forms that had long since outlived their evolutionary usefulness. In the abyssal darkness between stars, where the Emperor's hallowed light could not fully reach, and his divine protection grew chillingly thin, new forms of consciousness stirred. They carried within them the profound memories of what it meant to be human, while simultaneously reaching toward futures that no single human mind could ever fully comprehend. They were the fever dreams of a species in the throes of transition, the undeniable birth pangs of evolution that no amount of purification, no matter how brutal or extensive, could ever prevent. The Imperium would undoubtedly continue its relentless war against change for as long as its ancient, crumbling institutions managed to survive. It would burn entire worlds, sacrifice billions of lives, and commit any atrocity deemed necessary to preserve its narrow, stagnant vision of human purity. But evolution was inherently patient, infinitely adaptable, and ultimately, utterly irresistible. It would inevitably find cunning ways to survive every purification, learn from every brutal setback, and continue the profound transformation that had begun with a single fevered worker in a forgotten corner of a dying galaxy. In the liminal spaces between sanity and madness, between human and inhuman, between what was and what could be, the network patiently waited and grew, tirelessly preparing for the momentous day when the Imperium's final choice would be starkly presented: evolve or die, change or be consumed by the very stagnation it had fought so fiercely to maintain, embrace the future, or be utterly destroyed by its own obstinate refusal to accept that the future had already, irrevocably, begun. The fever spreads. The network grows. The transformation continues. One silent carrier at a time, one hidden symptom at a time, one failed purification at a time. In a galaxy where being sick is being suspicious, the greatest sickness of all is the one that cannot be detected until it is far too late to cure.